The Story of Civilization, Volume 3, Caesar and Christ, Part 2, by Will Durant. Continued. Cassette 10, Side 1. Meanwhile, the Alemanni and the Marcomanni, noting that the Rhine and Danube garrisons had been depleted to reinforce the legions in Syria, broke through the Roman limes and ravaged eastern Gaul. After celebrating his Persian triumph, Alexander, again with Mamaea at his side, rejoined his army and led it to Mainz. On his mother's advice, he negotiated with the enemy, offering them an annual sum to keep the peace. His troops condemned his weakness and mutinied. They had never forgiven his economy, his discipline, and his subordination of them to the Senate and a woman's rule. They acclaimed as emperor C. Julius Maximinus, commander of the Pannonian legions. The soldiers of Maximinus forced their way into Alexander's tent and slew him, his mother, and his friends in 235. 2. Anarchy. It was no whim of history that made the army supreme in the 3rd century. Internal causes had weakened the state and left it exposed on every front. The cessation of expansion after Trajan and again after Septimius Severus was the signal for attack. And as Rome had conquered nations by dividing them, so now the barbarians began to conquer her by uniting in simultaneous assaults. The necessity of defense exalted the power of arms and the prestige of soldiery. Generals replaced philosophers on the throne, and the last reign of the aristocracy yielded to the revived rule of force. Maximinus was a good soldier and no more, the robust son of a Thracian peasant. History assures us that he was 8 feet tall and had a thumb of such circumference that he could wear his wife's bracelet on it as a ring. He had no education, scorned it, and envied it. In his 3 years as emperor, he never visited Rome, but preferred the life of his camp on the Danube or the Rhine. To support his campaigns and appease his troops, he laid such taxes upon the well-to-do that an upper-class revolt soon formed against his rule. Gordianus, the wealthy and learned proconsul of Africa, accepted the nomination of his army as a rival emperor. Being 80 years old, he associated his son with him in the lethal office. They failed to withstand the forces sent against them by Maximinus. The son was killed in battle, the father killed himself. Maximinus revenged himself by proscriptions and confiscations that almost destroyed the aristocracy. Every day, says Herodian, one could see the richest men of yesterday turned beggars today. The Senate, which had been reconstituted and reinvigorated by Severus, fought back valiantly. It declared Maximinus an outlaw, and chose 2 of its members, Maximus and Balbinus, as emperors. Maximus led an improvised army to meet Maximinus, who came down across the Alps and besieged Aquileia. Maximinus was the better general and had the superior forces. The fate of the Senate and the propertied classes seemed sealed. But a group of Maximinus's soldiers who had suffered from his savage punishments killed him in his tent. Maximus returned in triumph to Rome and was assassinated along with Balbinus by the Praetorian Guard. The Praetorians made a 3rd Gordian emperor, and the Senate confirmed the choice. We shall not repeat in bloody detail the names and battles and deaths of these emperors of anarchy. In the 35 years between Alexander Severus and Aurelian, 37 men were proclaimed emperors. Gordian III was slain by his troops while fighting the Persians in 244. His successor Philip the Arab was defeated and killed at Verona by Decius in 249, an Illyrian of wealth and culture whose devotion to Rome well deserved a name so honorable in ancient history. Between campaigns against the Goths, he laid out an ambitious program for the restoration of Roman religion, morals, and character, and gave orders for the destruction of Christianity. Then he returned to the Danube, met the Goths, saw his son slain beside him, told his wavering army that the loss of any one individual was of little importance, pressed on against the enemy, and was himself struck down in one of the worst defeats in Roman history, this in 251. He was succeeded by Gallus, who was murdered by his troops in 253, and then by Aemilianus, who was murdered by his troops in 253. The new emperor, Valerian, already 60 and facing war at once with the Franks, the Alemanni, the Marcomanni, the Goths, the Scythians, and the Persians, made his son Gallienus ruler of the Western Empire, kept the east for himself, and led an army into Mesopotamia. He was too old for his tasks and soon succumbed. Gallienus, now 35, was a man of courage, intelligence, and a culture that seemed almost out of place in this century of barbaric war. He reformed the civilian administration in the West, led his armies to victory against one after another of the empire's enemies, and yet found time to enjoy and patronize philosophy and literature and promote a transient revival of classic art. But even his very genius was overwhelmed by the accumulating evils of the time. In 254, the Marcomanni raided Pannonia and North Italy. In 255, the Goths invaded Macedonia and Dalmatia. Scythians and Goths invaded Asia Minor, and Persians invaded Syria. In 257, the Goths captured the fleet of the Bosporan kingdom, ravaged the Greek cities on the Black Sea coasts, burned Trapezus and enslaved its people, and raided Pontus. In 258, they took Chalcedon, Nicomedia, Prusa, Apamea, Nicaea. In the same year, the Persians conquered Armenia, and Postumus declared himself the independent ruler of Gaul. In 259, the Alemanni broke into Italy but were defeated by Gallienus at Milan. In 260, Valerian was overwhelmed by the Persians at Edessa and died in captivity at a time and place unknown. Shapur I and his clouds of cavalry advanced through Syria to Antioch, surprised the population in the midst of its games, sacked the city, killed thousands, and led more thousands into slavery. Tarsus was taken and devastated, Cilicia and Cappadocia were overrun, and Shapur returned to Persia laden with spoils. Within a decade, 3 ignominious tragedies had overtaken Rome. A Roman emperor had for the first time fallen in defeat, another had been captured by the enemy, and the unity of the empire had been sacrificed to the necessity of meeting simultaneous attacks on many fronts. Under the force of these blows and the disorderly elevation and assassination of emperors by troops, the imperial prestige collapsed. Those psychological forces which time consecrates into habitual and unquestioned authority lost their hold upon Rome's enemies, even upon her subjects and citizens. Revolts broke out everywhere. In Sicily and Gaul, the oppressed peasantry flared up in wild jacquerie. In Pannonia, Ingenuus proclaimed himself sovereign of the eastern provinces. In 263, the Goths sailed down the Ionian coast, sacked Ephesus, and burned down the great temple of Artemis. All the Hellenistic East was in terror. An unexpected ally saved the empire in Asia. Odenathus, who governed Palmyra as a vassal of Rome, drove the Persians back across Mesopotamia, defeated them at Tisiphon in 261, and declared himself king of Syria, Cilicia, Arabia, Cappadocia, and Armenia. He was assassinated in 266. His youthful son succeeded to his titles, his widow to his power. Like Cleopatra, from whom she claimed descent, Zenobia combined beauty of person with statesmanly capacity and many accomplishments of mind. She studied Greek literature and philosophy, learned Latin, Egyptian, and Syriac, and wrote a history of the East. Apparently connecting chastity with vigor, she allowed herself only such sexual relations as were needed for motherhood. She inured herself to hardship and fatigue, enjoyed the dangers of the chase, and marched on foot for miles at the head of her troops. She governed with sternness and wisdom, made the philosopher Longinus her premier, gathered scholars, poets, and artists at her court, and beautified her capital with Greco-Roman Asiatic palaces whose ruins startle the desert traveler today. Feeling that the empire was breaking up, she planned a new dynasty and realm, brought Cappadocia, Galatia, and most of Bithynia under her control, fitted out a great army and fleet, conquered Egypt, and took Alexandria after a siege that destroyed half the population. The subtle Queen of the East pretended that she was proceeding as the agent of the Roman power, but all the world knew that her victories were an act in the spacious drama of Rome's collapse. Seeing the wealth and weakness of the empire, the barbarians poured down into the Balkans and Greece. While the Sarmatians pillaged again the cities on the Black Sea, a branch of the Goths sailed in 500 ships through the Hellespont into the Aegean, took isle after isle, anchored in the Piraeus, and sacked Athens, Argos, Sparta, Corinth, and Thebes, this in 267. While their navy brought some of the marauders back to the Black Sea, another group fought its way overland towards its Danube home. Gallienus met them at the river Nestus in Thrace and won a costly victory, but a year later he was murdered by his troops. In 269 another Gothic horde descended into Macedonia, besieged Thessalonica, and pillaged Greece, Rhodes, Cyprus, and the Ionian coast. The Emperor Claudius II rescued Thessalonica, drove the Goths up the Vardar Valley, and defeated them with great slaughter at Naissus, the modern Nish, this in 269. If he had lost that battle, no army would have intervened between the Goths and Italy. 3. The economic decline. Political anarchy accelerated economic disintegration, and economic decline promoted political decay. Each was the cause and effect of the other. Roman statesmanship had never found a healthy economic life for Italy, and perhaps the narrow plains of the peninsula have never provided an adequate base for the soaring aims of the Italian state. The production of cereals was discouraged by the competition of cheap grains from Sicily, Africa, and Egypt, and the great vineyards were losing their markets to provincial wines. Farmers complained that high taxes consumed their precarious profits and left them too little to keep the drainage and irrigation canals in repair. The canals filled up, the marshes spread, and malaria weakened the population of the Campania and Rome. Large tracts of fertile land had been withdrawn from cultivation for residential estates. The absentee owners of the latifundia exploited labor and the soil to the limit of tolerance, and absolved themselves by philanthropies in the towns. Urban architecture and games profited while the countryside grew desolate. Many peasant proprietors and free rural workers abandoned the farms for the cities, leaving Italian agriculture for the most part to latifundia manned by listless slaves. But the latifundia themselves were ruined by the Pax Romana, the dearth of wars of conquest in the 1st and 2nd centuries, and the consequent fall in the supply and rise in the cost of slaves. Compelled to lure free labor back to the land, the great landlords divided their holdings into units which they leased to coloni, cultivators. They required from these tenants a small money rent or a tenth of the produce, and a period of unpaid labor in the owner's villa or on his private domain. In many cases, landlords found it profitable to emancipate their slaves and change them into coloni. In the 3rd century, the owners, harassed by invasion and revolution in the cities, took more and more to living in their villas. These were fortified into castles and were gradually transformed into medieval chateaux. The lack of slaves strengthened for a time the position of free labor in industry as well as in agriculture. But while the resources of the rich were consumed by war and government, the poverty of the poor did not decrease. Wages were from 6 to 11, prices some 33% of comparative wages and prices in the United States of the early 20th century. The class struggle was becoming more violent, for the army, recruited from the provincial poor, often joined in the attack upon wealth and felt that its services to the state justified confiscatory taxation for donatives, or more direct pillaging of the well-to-do. Industry suffered as commerce declined. The export trade of Italy fell as the provinces graduated from customers to competitors. Barbarian raids and piracy made trade routes as unsafe as before Pompey. Depreciated currencies and uncertain prices discouraged long-term enterprise. The extension of the frontier having ceased, Italy could no longer prosper by supplying or exploiting an expanding realm. Once Italy had collected the bullion of conquered lands and grown rich on the robbery. Now money was migrating to the more industrialized Hellenistic provinces, and Italy grew poorer while the rising wealth of Asia Minor forced the replacement of Rome with an eastern capital. Italian industry was thrown back upon its domestic market and found the people too poor to buy the goods they could make. Internal commerce was hampered by brigands, rising taxes, and the deterioration of roads through lack of slaves. The villas became more self-sufficient in industry, and barter competed with money trade. Large-scale production gave way year by year to small shops, supplying chiefly a local demand. Financial difficulties entered. The precious metals were running low. The gold mines of Thrace and the silver mines of Spain had reduced their yield, and Dacia, with its gold, would soon be surrendered by Aurelian. Much gold and silver had been consumed in art and ornament. Faced with this dearth when war was almost continuous, the emperors, from Septimius Severus onward, repeatedly debased the currency to pay for state expenses and military supplies. Under Nero, the alloy in the denarius was 10%, under Commodius 30%, under Septimius 50%. Caracalla replaced it with the Antoninianus, containing 50% silver. By 260, its silver content had sunk to 5%. The government mints issued unprecedented quantities of cheap coin. In many instances, the state compelled the acceptance of these at their face value instead of their actual worth, while it insisted that taxes should be paid in goods or gold. Prices rose rapidly. In Palestine, they increased 1,000% between the 1st and 3rd centuries. In Egypt, inflation ran out of control, so that a measure of wheat that had cost 8 drachmas in the 1st century cost 120,000 drachmas at the end of the 3rd. Other provinces suffered much less, but in most of them inflation ruined a large part of the middle class, nullified trust funds and charitable foundations, rendered all business discouragingly precarious, and destroyed a considerable portion of the trading and investment capital upon which the economic life of the empire depended. The emperors after Pertinax were not displeased by this attrition of the aristocracy and the bourgeoisie. They felt the hostility of the senatorial class and the great merchants to their alien origin, their martial despotism, and their exactions. The war of Senate and Emperor, interrupted from Nerva to Aurelius, was renewed, and by donatives, public works, and doles, the rulers deliberately based their powers upon the favor of the army, the proletariat, and the peasantry. The empire suffered only less than Italy. Carthage and North Africa, farthest from the invaders, flourished, but Egypt decayed under destructive factionalism, Caracalla's massacre, Zenobia's conquest, high taxes, listless forced labor, and Rome's annual exaction of grain. Asia Minor and Syria had borne invasion and pillaging, but their ancient and patient industries had survived all tribulations. Greece, Macedonia, and Thrace had been devastated by the barbarians, and Byzantium had not recovered from Septimius's siege. As war brought Roman garrisons and supplies to the German frontier, new cities rose along the rivers: Vienna, Karlsburg, Strasbourg, Mainz. Gaul had been disordered and discouraged by German attacks. 60 of her cities had been sacked, most of her towns and cities were shrinking within new walls, and were abandoning the broad, straight streets of Roman design for more easily defended irregular alleys of early antiquity and the Middle Ages. In Britain, too, the cities were becoming smaller, the villas larger. Class war and high taxation had destroyed wealth or driven it into rural concealment. The empire had begun with urbanization and civilization. It was ending in re-ruralization and barbarism. 4. The twilight of paganism. The cultural graph of the 3rd century follows loosely the curve of declining wealth and power. Nevertheless, in these tragic years we have the rise of notational algebra, the highest names in Roman jurisprudence, the finest example of ancient literary criticism, some of Rome's most majestic architecture, the oldest romantic novels, the greatest of mystic philosophers. The Greek anthology summarizes the life of Diophantus of Alexandria, AD 250, with algebraic humor. His boyhood lasted 1/6 of his life, his beard grew after 1/12 more, he married after another 7th, his son was born 5 years later and lived to half his father's age, and the father died 4 years after his son, therefore at the age of 84. Of his works, the chief survivor is the Arithmetica, a treatise on algebra. It solves determinate equations of the 1st degree, determinate quadratic equations, and indeterminate equations up to the 6th degree. For the unknown quantity which we denote by x, and which he called arithmos, the number, he used a Greek sigma, and for the other powers he used the letters of the Greek alphabet. An algebra without symbols had existed before him. Plato had recommended, for training and amusing the youthful mind, such problems as the distribution of apples in certain proportions among several persons. Archimedes had propounded like puzzles in the 3rd century BC, and both the Egyptians and the Greeks had solved geometrical problems by algebraic methods without algebraic notation. Probably Diophantus systematized methods already familiar to his contemporaries. The accident of time has preserved him, and to him through the Arabs we trace that bold and esoteric symbolism which aspires to formulate all the quantitative relations of the world. Papinian, Paulus, and Ulpian, the culminating trio of Roman law, all rose to power under Septimius Severus. All, as prefects of the Praetorian Guard, were the prime ministers of the realm, and all justified absolute monarchy on the ground that the people had delegated their sovereignty to the emperor. Papinian's Questiones and Responsa were so distinguished by clarity, humanity, and justice that Justinian's collections leaned heavily on these works. When Caracalla killed Geta, he bade Papinian write a legal defense of the act. Papinian refused, saying that it was easier to commit fratricide than to justify it. Caracalla ordered him beheaded, and a soldier performed the deed with an axe in the presence of the emperor. Domitius Ulpianus continued Papinian's labors as jurist and humanitarian. His legal opinions defended slaves as by nature free, and women as endowed with the same rights as men. Like most landmarks in the history of law, his writings were essentially a coordination of his predecessor's work, but his judgments were so definitive that nearly a third of them survive in the Digest of Justinian. It was because Alexander Severus ruled chiefly in accord with Ulpian's advice, says Lampridius, that he was so excellent an emperor. However, Ulpian had had some of his opponents put to death, and in 228 his enemies in the guard killed him in turn, with less legality and equal effect. Diocletian encouraged and financed schools of law and commissioned the codification of post-Trajanic legislation in the Codex Gregorianus. Thereafter the science of jurisprudence hibernated till Justinian. The 3rd century continued the art of painting on Pompeian and Alexandrian lines. Its meager remains are oriental and crude and almost effaced by time. Sculpture flourished, for many emperors had to be carved. It stiffened into a primitive frontality, but no later age has surpassed this one in portraits of startling veracity. It is a credit to Caracalla, or a testimony to his dullness, that he allowed a sculptor to transmit him to us as the curly-headed scowling brute of the Naples Museum. 2 sculptural colossi date from this period, the Farnese Bull and the Farnese Hercules, both of them exaggerated and unpleasantly tense, but showing undiminished technical mastery. That sculptors could still work in the classic style appears from the chaste reliefs on the sarcophagus of Alexander Severus and on the Ludovisi battle sarcophagus. But the reliefs on the Arch of Septimius Severus at Rome frankly rejected Attic simplicity and grace for a coarse and picturesque virility that almost foreshadowed the rebarbarization of Italy. Architecture at Rome now carried to completion the Roman flair for sublimity through size. Septimius raised on the Palatine the last of its imperial palaces, with an eastern wing 7 stories high, the Septizonium. Julia Domna provided funds for the Atrium Vesti and the pretty temple of Vesta that still stands in the Forum. Caracalla built for Isis's consort Serapis an immense shrine of which some handsome fragments survive. The baths of Caracalla, finished under Alexander Severus, are among the world's most impressive ruins. They added nothing to architectural science, following essentially the lines of Trajan's baths, but their frowning mass well expressed the murderer of Geta and Papinian. The main block of brick and concrete covered 270,000 square feet, more than the Houses of Parliament and Westminster Hall combined. A winding stairway led to the top of the walls. Perched there, Shelley wrote Prometheus Unbound. The interior was garrisoned by a multitude of statues and upheld by 200 columns of granite, alabaster, and porphyry. The marble floors and walls were inlaid with mosaic scenes. Water poured from massive mouths of silver into pools and basins where 1,600 persons could bathe at once. Gallienus and Decius raised similar baths. In the latter case, the Roman engineers rested a circular dome upon a decagonal edifice and supported it with buttresses in the angles of the decagon, an expedient with little past and much future. In 295, Maximian began the most enormous of the 11 imperial thermae and named it with singular modesty the Baths of Diocletian. Here were bathing facilities for 3,600 persons at one time, gymnasiums, concert, and lecture halls. Out of one room, the Tepidarium, Michelangelo fashioned Santa Maria degli Angeli, with the exception of St. Peter's, the largest church in Rome. Structures only less monumental rose in the provinces. Diocletian built extensively in Nicomedia, Alexandria, and Antioch. Maximian adorned Milan, Galerius Sirmium, Constantius Treves. Literature prospered less, for it could seldom tap the wealth that gathered in imperial hands. Libraries grew in number and size. A 3rd-century physician had a collection of 62,000 volumes, and the Bibliotheca Ulpiana was renowned for its historical archives. Diocletian sent scholars to Alexandria to transcribe classical texts there and bring copies to the libraries of Rome. Scholars were plentiful and popular. Philostratus memorialized them well in his Lives of the Sophists. Porphyry continued Plotinus, attacked Christianity, and called the world to vegetarianism. Iamblichus tried to harmonize Platonism and pagan theology, and succeeded sufficiently to inspire the Emperor Julian. Diogenes Laertius put together the lives and opinions of the philosophers in fascinating excerpt and anecdote. Athenaeus Naucratis, having consumed the libraries of Alexandria, poured his chyme into the deipnosophists, or sophists of the dinner table, a dreary dialogue on foods, sauces, courtesans, philosophers, and words, brightened here and there by some revelation of ancient custom or some reminiscence of great men. Longinus, perhaps of Palmyra, composed a polished essay, Peri Hypsus, on the sublime. The peculiar pleasure given by literature, runs the argument, is due to the lifting up, or ecstasis, of the reader by the eloquence that comes to a writer from strength of conviction and sincerity of character. Dio Cassius Coxianus of Bithynian Nicaea, after a life spent in the Cursus Honorum, began at 55 to write his History of Rome, this possibly in 210. In his 74th year he completed it, having carried the story down from Romulus to himself. Of its 80 books, less than half remain, but they fill 8 substantial volumes. It is a work of noble scope rather than high quality. It has vivid narratives, revealing speeches, and philosophical asides that are not always platitudinous and conservative. But like Livy, it is disfigured with portents. Like Tacitus, it is a long brief for the senatorial opposition. And like all Roman histories, it cleaves narrowly to the vicissitudes of politics and war, as if life for 1,000 years had been nothing but taxes and death. More significant than these honorable men for the historian of the mind is the appearance in this century of the romantic novel. It had had a long preparation in the Chiropaidia of Xenophon, the love poems of Callimachus, the legends that had accumulated about Alexander, and the Milesian tales told by Aristides and others in the 2nd century BC and afterward. These stories of adventure and love pleased an Ionian populace so classic in tradition but so oriental in mood, perhaps now oriental in blood. Petronius in Rome, Apuleius in Africa, Lucian in Greece, Iamblichus in Syria developed a picaresque romance in varied ways, with no special accent on love. In the first Christian centuries, possibly responding to an increasing audience of women readers, the novel of adventure merged with the romance of love. Our oldest extant example is the Ethiopica, or Egyptian tales, of Heliodorus of Emesa. Of its date there is much dispute, but we may provisionally assign it to the 3rd century. It begins in a style honorable with age. The day had begun to smile cheerfully, and the sun was already brightening the tops of the hills, when a band of men, in arms and appearance pirates, having ascended the summit of a slope that overlooks the Heracleotic mouth of the Nile, paused and surveyed the sea. Finding no sail there to promise them booty, they turned their eyes to the shore beneath them, and this is what they saw. At once we meet the rich and handsome youth Theagenes and the lovely and tearful Princess Chariclea. They have been captured by pirates, and there befalls them such a medley of mishaps, misunderstandings, battles, murders, and reunions as might supply a season's fiction today. Whereas in Petronius and Apuleius the chastity of maidens is a matter of swiftly passing concern, it is here the essence and pivot of the tale. Heliodorus preserves Chariclea's virginity through a score of narrow escapes, and writes persuasive homilies on the beauty and necessity of feminine virtue. There may be here some Christian influence. Indeed, tradition made the author become the Christian bishop of Thessalonica. The Ethiopica unwittingly fathered an endless chain of imitations. Here is the model for Cervantes's Persiles y Sigismunda, the story of Clorinda in Tasso's Jerusalem Delivered, and the vast romances of Madame de Scudéry. Here are the love potions, signs, moans, faintings, and happy endings of a million pleasant tales. Here is Clarissa Harlowe, 1,500 years before Richardson. The most famous love story in ancient prose was Daphnis and Chloe. Of its author we know only the name Longus. We merely guess at the 3rd century as his time. Daphnis is exposed at birth, is rescued and reared by a shepherd, and becomes a shepherd in turn. Excellent passages of rural description suggest that Longus, like his poetic model Theocritus, had discovered the country after long residence in the city. Daphnis falls in love with a peasant girl who has also been rescued from infant exposure. They tend their flocks in charming comradeship, bathe together in innocent nudity, and intoxicate each other with an unprecedented kiss. An old neighbor explains their fever to them and describes from his own youth the sickness of romantic love. "I thought not of my food, I cared not for my drink. I could take no rest, and sleep deserted me. My soul was heavy with sadness, my heart beat quickly, my limbs felt a deadly chill." In the end, their fathers, now wealthy, discover and enrich them, but they ignore their wealth and return to their modest pastoral life. The tale is told with the simplicity of finished art. Translated into supple French by Amiot in 1559, it became the model for Saint-Pierre's Paul and Virginia, and the inspiration of countless paintings, poems, and musical compositions. Akin to it is a fragment of poetry known as Per Vigilium Veneris, the Eve of Venus. No one knows who wrote it or when. Probably it belongs to this century. The theme is that of Lucretius's apostrophe and Longus's romance, that the goddess of love, by inflaming all living things with reckless desire, is the real creator of the world. Tomorrow let him love who never loved. Tomorrow let him love who loved before. Fresh spring has come and sings her amorous song. The world is born anew, and vernal love drives birds to mate, and all the waiting woods unloose their tresses to the showers of spring. Tomorrow let him love who never loved, and let him love who loved before. So the limpid verse flows on, finding the work of love in the fertilizing rain, in the forms of lovers, in the songs of merry festivals, in the awkward tentatives of desirous youth, in timid trysts amid woodland haunts. And after each stanza the pithy promise returns. Cras amet qui numquam amavit, quique amavit cras amet. Here in the last great lyric poem of the pagan soul we hear the trochaic cadence of medieval hymns and a melodious premonition of the troubadours. 5. The Oriental Monarchy. When Claudius II died of a pestilence that was decimating Goths and Romans alike in 270, the army chose as his successor the son of an Illyrian peasant. Domitius Aurelianus had risen from the lowest ranks by strength of body and will. His nickname was Manu ad Ferrum, hand on sword. It was a sign of reawakened good sense in the army that it chose a man who exacted as hard a discipline from others as from himself. Under his lead, the enemies of Rome were repulsed at every point except the Danube. There Aurelian ceded Dacia to the Goths, hoping that they would stand as a barrier between the empire and ulterior hordes. Perhaps encouraged by this surrender, the Alemanni and the Vandals invaded Italy, but Aurelian in 3 battles overcame and dispersed them. Meditating distant campaigns and fearing an assault upon Rome during his absence, he persuaded the Senate to finance and the guilds to erect new walls around the capital. Everywhere in the empire, city walls were being built, signifying the weakening of the imperial power and the end of the Roman peace. Preferring offense to defense, Aurelian determined to restore the empire by attacking Zenobia in the east, and then Tetricus, who had succeeded Postumus as the usurper of sovereignty in Gaul. While his general Probus recovered Egypt from Zenobia's son, Aurelian marched through the Balkans, crossed the Hellespont, defeated the queen's army at Emesa, and besieged her capital. She tried to escape and enlist Persia's aid, but was captured. The city surrendered and was spared, but Longinus was put to death in 272. While the emperor was leading his army back to the Hellespont, Palmyra revolted and slew the garrison he had left there. He turned about with the speed of Caesar, again besieged and soon took the city. Now he abandoned it to pillage by his troops, razed its walls, rerouted its trade, and let it lapse into the desert village that it had been before and is today. Zenobia graced in golden chains Aurelian's triumph in Rome and was allowed to spend her remaining years in comparative freedom at Tibur. In 274, Aurelian defeated Tetricus at Chalons and returned Gaul, Spain, and Britain to the empire. Happy at the resumption of its mastery, Rome hailed the victor as restitutor orbis, restorer of the world. Returning to the tasks of peace, he re-established some economic order by reforming the Roman coinage, and reorganized the government by applying to it the same severe discipline that had regenerated the army. Ascribing Rome's moral and political chaos in some degree to religious disunity, and impressed by the political services of religion in the East, he sought to unite old faiths and new in a monotheistic worship of the sun god and of the emperor as the vicar of that deity on earth. He informed the skeptical army and senate that it was the god, and not their choice or confirmation, that had made him emperor. He built at Rome a resplendent temple of the sun, in which he hoped the Baal of Emesa and the god of Mithraism would merge. Monarchy and monotheism were advancing side by side, each seeking to make the other its aid. Aurelian's religious policy suggested that the power of the state was falling, that of religion rising. Kings were now kings by the grace of God. This was the oriental conception of government, old in Egypt, Persia, and Syria. In accepting it, Aurelian advanced that orientalization of the monarchy which had begun with Elagabalus and would complete itself in Diocletian and Constantine. In 275, as Aurelian was leading an army across Thrace to settle matters with Persia, a group of officers, misled into thinking that he planned to execute them, assassinated him. Shocked by its own accumulated crimes, the army asked the Senate to appoint a successor. None wanted an honor that so regularly heralded death. Finally, Tacitus, being 75 years old, consented to serve. He claimed descent from the historian and illustrated all the virtues preached by that laconic pessimist, but he died of exhaustion 6 months after taking the crown. The soldiers, repenting their repentance, resumed the prerogative of force and saluted Probus as emperor in 276. It was an excellent choice and a merited name, for Probus stood out in courage and integrity. He expelled the Germans from Gaul, cleared the Vandals from Illyricum, built a wall between the Rhine and the Danube, frightened the Persians with a word, and gave peace to the whole Roman realm. Soon he pledged his people there would be no arms, no armies, and no wars, and the reign of law would cover the earth. As a prelude to this utopia, he compelled his troops to clear wastelands, drain marshes, plant vines, and perform other public works. The army resented this sublimation, murdered him in 282, mourned him, and built a monument to his memory. It now held as imperator one Diocles, the son of a Dalmatian freedman. Diocletian, as he henceforth called himself, had risen by brilliant talents and flexible scruples to the consulate, a proconsulate, and command of the palace guards. He was a man of genius, less skilled in war than in statesmanship. He came to the throne after a period of anarchy worse than that which had prevailed from the Gracchi to Antony. Like Augustus, he pacified all parties, protected all frontiers, extended the role of government, and based his rule on the aid and sanction of religion. Augustus had created the empire, Aurelian had saved it, Diocletian reorganized it. His first vital decision revealed the state of the realm and the waning of Rome. He abandoned the city as a capital and made his imperial headquarters at Nicomedia in Asia Minor, a few miles south of Byzantium. The Senate still met in Rome, the consuls went through their ritual, the games roared on, the streets still bore the noisome pullulation of humanity. But power and leadership had gone from this center of economic and moral decay. Diocletian based his move on military necessity. Europe and Asia must be defended and could not be defended from a city so far south of the Alps. Hence he appointed a capable general, Maximian, as his co-ruler in 286, charging him with defense of the West, and Maximian made not Rome but Milan his capital. 6 years later, to further facilitate administration and defense, each of the two Augusti chose a Caesar as his aide and successor. Diocletian selected Galerius, who made his capital at Sirmium, now Mitrovica on the Save, and was responsible for the Danube provinces. And Maximian appointed Constantius Chlorus, the Pale, who made his capital at Augusta Treverorum, now Treves. Each Augustus pledged himself to retire after 20 years in favor of his Caesar, who would then appoint a Caesar to aid and succeed him in turn. Each Augustus gave his daughter in marriage to his Caesar, adding the ties of blood to those of law. In this way, Diocletian hoped, wars of succession would be avoided, government would recapture continuity and authority, and the empire would stand on guard at 4 strategic points against internal rebellion and external attack. It was a brilliant arrangement which had every virtue but unity and freedom. The monarchy was divided, but it was absolute. Each law of each ruler was issued in the name of all 4 and was valid for the realm. The edict of the rulers became law at once, without the sanction of the Senate at Rome. All governmental officials were appointed by the rulers, and a gigantic bureaucracy spread its coils around the state. To further fortify the system, Diocletian developed the cult of the emperor's Genius into a personal worship of himself as the earthly embodiment of Jupiter, while Maximian modestly consented to be Hercules. Wisdom and force had come down from heaven to restore order and peace on earth. Diocletian assumed a diadem, a broad white fillet set with pearls, and robes of silk and gold. His shoes were studded with precious gems. He kept himself aloof in his palace and required visitors to pass the gauntlet of ceremonious eunuchs and titled chamberlains, and to kneel and kiss the hem of his robe. He was a man of the world and doubtless smiled in private at these myths and forms. But his throne lacked the legitimacy of time, and he hoped to buttress it, to check the turbulence of the populace and the revolts of the army, by enduing himself with divinity and awe. He had himself called Dominus, says Aurelius Victor, but he behaved like a father. This adoption of oriental despotism by the son of a slave, this identification of God and king, meant the final failure of republican institutions in antiquity, the surrender of the fruits of Marathon. It was a reversion, like Alexander's, to the forms and theories of Achaemenid and Egyptian courts, of Ptolemaic, Parthian, and Sassanid kings. From this orientalized monarchy came the structure of Byzantine and European kingdoms till the French Revolution. All that was needed now was to ally the oriental monarch in an oriental capital with an oriental faith. Byzantinism began with Diocletian. 6. The socialism of Diocletian. He proceeded with Caesarian energy to remake every branch of the government. He transformed the aristocracy by raising to it many civil or military officials, and making it a hereditary caste with an oriental gradation of dignities, profusion of titles, and complexity of etiquette. He and his colleagues redivided the empire into 96 provinces, grouped into 72 dioceses and 4 prefectures, and appointed civil and military rulers for each division. It was a frankly centralized state, which considered local autonomy like democracy a luxury of security and peace, and excused its dictatorship by the needs of actual or imminent war. Wars were waged, and with brilliant success. Constantius recovered revolted Britain, and Galerius defeated the Persians so decisively that they surrendered Mesopotamia and 5 provinces beyond the Tigris. For a generation, Rome's enemies were held at bay. In years of peace, Diocletian, with his aides, faced the problems of economic decay. To overcome depression and prevent revolution, he substituted a managed economy for the law of supply and demand. He established a sound currency by guaranteeing to the gold coinage a fixed weight and purity which it retained in the Eastern Empire till 1453. He distributed food to the poor at half the market price or free, and undertook extensive public works to appease the unemployed. To ensure the supply of necessaries for the cities and the armies, he brought many branches of industry under complete state control, beginning with the import of grain. He persuaded the shipowners, merchants, and crews engaged in this trade to accept such control in return for governmental guarantee of security in employment and returns. The state had long since owned most quarries, salt deposits, and mines. Now it forbade the export of salt, iron, gold, wine, grain, or oil from Italy, and strictly regulated the importation of these articles. It went on to control establishments producing for the army, the bureaucracy, or the court. In munition factories, textile mills, and bakeries, the government required a minimum product, bought this at its own price, and made the associations of manufacturers responsible for carrying out orders and specifications. If this procedure proved inadequate, it completely nationalized these factories and manned them with labor bound to the job. Gradually, under Aurelian and Diocletian, the majority of industrial establishments and guilds in Italy were brought under the control of the corporate state. Butchers, bakers, masons, builders, glass blowers, iron workers, and gravers were ruled by detailed governmental regulations. The various corporations, says Rostovtsev, were more like minor supervisors of their own concerns on behalf of the state than their owners. They were themselves in bondage to the officials of the various departments and to the commanders of the various military units. The associations of tradesmen and artisans received various privileges from the government and often exerted pressure upon its policies. In return, they served as organs of national administration, helped to regiment labor, and collected taxes for the state from their membership. Similar methods of governmental control were extended in the late 3rd and early 4th centuries to provincial armament, food, and clothing industries. In every province, says Paul Louis, special procuratores superintended industrial activities. In every large town, the state became a powerful employer, standing head and shoulders above the private industrialists who were in any case crushed by taxation. Such a system could not work without price control. In 301, Diocletian and his colleagues issued an Edictum de Pretiis, dictating maximum legal prices or wages for all important articles or services in the empire. Its preamble attacks monopolists who, in an economy of scarcity, had kept goods from the market to raise prices. Who is so devoid of human feeling as not to see that immoderate prices are widespread in the markets of our cities, and that the passion for gain is lessened neither by plentiful supplies nor by fruitful years, so that evil men reckon it is their loss if abundance comes? There are men whose aim it is to restrain general prosperity, to seek usurious and ruinous returns. Avarice rages throughout the world. Wherever our armies are compelled to go for the common safety, profiteers extort prices not merely 4 or 8 times the normal, but beyond any words to describe. Sometimes the soldier must exhaust his salary and his bonus in one purchase, so that the contributions of the whole world to support the armies fall to the abominable profits of thieves. The edict was until our time the most famous example of an attempt to replace economic laws by governmental decrees. Its failure was rapid and complete. Tradesmen concealed their commodities, scarcities became more acute than before, Diocletian himself was accused of conniving at a rise in prices, riots occurred, and the edict had to be relaxed to restore production and distribution. It was finally revoked by Constantine. The weakness of this managed economy lay in its administrative cost. The required bureaucracy was so extensive that Lactantius, doubtless with political license, estimated it at half the population. The bureaucrats found their task too great for human integrity, their surveillance too sporadic for the evasive ingenuity of men. To support the bureaucracy, the court, the army, the building program, and the dole, taxation rose to unprecedented peaks of ubiquitous continuity. As the state had not yet discovered the plan of public borrowing to conceal its wastefulness and postpone its reckoning, the cost of each year's operations had to be met from each year's revenue. To avoid returns in depreciating currencies, Diocletian directed that, where possible, taxes should be collected in kind. Taxpayers were required to transport their tax quotas to governmental warehouses, and a laborious organization was built up to get the goods thence to their final destination. In each municipality, the decuriones, or municipal officials, were held financially responsible for any shortage in the payment of the taxes assessed upon their communities. Since every taxpayer sought to evade taxes, the state organized a special force of revenue police to examine every man's property and income. Torture was used upon wives, children, and slaves to make them reveal the hidden wealth or earnings of the household, and severe penalties were enacted for evasion. This book is continued at this point on the other side of this cassette. Please reverse or turn the cassette over now.